Good evening. If I could have your attention so we could start. Welcome. I'm very happy to see you all, and I'm going to introduce in just a few minutes our very distinguished guest, Vladislav Davidzon. But before I do that, let me just say that I'm Professor Maxim Shrayer. I'm in my 28th year here at BC. I chair the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies, and I also direct our interdisciplinary major in East European and Eurasian Studies. I also have the pleasure of having been founding co-director of our Jewish Studies program here at BC, which some of you probably know, but others may not. We launched some years ago. At the time, it was the first degree-granting Jewish Studies program in U.S. Catholic education, higher education, and right now our program is enjoying really a renaissance, and this is very much owing to the work of my very good friend and colleague, Professor Matt Sienkiewicz, who is here, and I just want to acknowledge that because he is behind a lot of the Jewish Studies events we have on campus, and of course behind this event. I also want to thank our sponsors, Jewish Studies program, my own home department, and also the Boston College Bookstore, and we will be able to purchase this wonderful book by Vladislav Davidzon, and he will also autograph it for you. So if you're interested after the talk, please come up and purchase your copy at, I think, a very steep discount. In any case, without further ado, I just want to say that this lecture is particularly important because, as you all know, we are living through two wars simultaneously, and the topic of today's lecture is how these two wars, Russia's war in Ukraine and the Hamas attack on Israel and the war in Israel, are changing politics, changing our world. And I can't think of a better person to speak on the subject than Vladislav Davidzon, who is a journalist, a writer, a public intellectual, and this is probably something I should mention. I can't think of another journalist who can speak competently both about the war in Ukraine, on which he reported from the trenches, and about the Cannes Film Festival, in which he reports annually. Yes, and this is, I think, to me, a matter of great distinction. Vladislav Davidzon is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, a co-producer for a television series on the effects of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and since 2012, he also serves as the European correspondent for Tablet magazine. You probably know that he regularly publishes reports about politics, culture that come from Europe, and many of them were covering the war in Ukraine. He has been an investigative journalist and researcher with assignments in Russia, Ukraine, England, and Poland. Davidzon also founded the Odessa Review, which is a very important English language publication that is published, as you might have guessed, in Ukraine, right? That great seaport founded by Catherine the Great in the 18th century. His work has been featured in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, World Policy Journal, the New York Observer, and the American Interest. And he's the author of two wonderful books, and one is called From Odessa with Love, and the other, his newest, The Birth of a Political Nation, but I'll let Vlad tell you about it. And lastly, so Vlad, before I formally welcome you to the podium, I just want to read this very exciting title. The title is complex. It has a lot of capitals in it. Moscow, Kyiv, Jerusalem, and the birth of a political nation. Israeli-Ukrainian relations in the context of the Hamas-Israel war. Please help me welcome Vladislav Davidzon.
Thank you, Professor, as always, for your friendship, for your generosity, your graciousness, for inviting me here. And we're also colleagues at Tablet magazine, and you would all be remiss not to read Professor Shrayer's work. He's a wonderful writer and a very, very bright moral intellect and someone that I never miss his pieces in tablet or anywhere else. So indeed, it's a very long title, and there's a lot to say about all these things. So we're going to try to maybe pack a lot of information, pack a lot of very complex things into as little time as possible. If you want to yell at me or argue with me or yell at me again, I'm happy to do it. Just wait until the Q&A. Israel brings out the worst in people and the best in people, obviously. So it's a wartime situation, a wartime sincerity. So we're going to wait, if we have very strong emotions about something, till the Q&A when we can argue and butt heads and yell at each other. Yeah, this is a complicated thing, so we're gonna try to retain our emotions and our tranquility until the Q&A, in which case we will be less tranquil. So this is a little paragraph, part of an essay that I wrote a month after October 7th to explain the context of the Russian policy in the Middle East vis-a-vis Israel. Obviously, Russia, Israel, Ukraine is a very complex triangle politically. The Russians have a very complex situation in their policy in the Middle East, in the Levant. You may all know that the Russians were the Air Force of the Syrian regime, which is why Assad won the civil war in Syria, exclusively because of Russian air power that he could rely on. And to this day, Russia is still a very important power player in the Levant and the Middle East, as the Americans have drawn down their presence. Everyone knows about the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Again, not to make prescriptive, rather descriptive comments, not good or bad, but America wanted to draw down its presence in the Middle East around 2014, 2015, and the Obama administration did so by downgrading Israeli and Sunni bloc relations and upgrading the Shiites and the Shiite axis, right? We all know this, right? This is not a secret to anybody. This is known colloquially as the Iran deal. The Iran deal is the preamble to a lot of what's happening now in the Middle East, and you have to understand that the Iran deal is the pretext to what's going on. So this is something that I wrote a month after October 7th in order to explain the context of the Russian-Israeli relationship. Israel's steadfast commitment to a doctrine of non-intervention in the wars raging in Eastern Europe and the Middle East constituted a signature policy and personal commitment in Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's regional security policy. So Netanyahu very skillfully kept Israel out of the Syrian civil war, which could have easily seeped into Israel, right? Could have very easily broken out in Israel that one of Assad's enemies or one of the regional commanders in one of the opposition movements, one of the rebel movements, could have started a firefight with the Israelis. The Iranian troops were operating on the Golan Heights and across the Israeli border. There are Hezbollah and Iranian Revolutionary Guards troops moving freely around Syria, which they did not before the war. This is, of course, a security problem for Israel, and it could have very easily exploded into a regional war. Now, that regional war might still start, and the Biden administration is doing everything they can to clamp down on the possibility of a regional war. In security circles is known as giving Israel a bear hug to keep them close, in order to both protect them and to keep them from doing anything more. In Iran, we obviously know that the Houthis, the pirates, who are Iranian proxies, are engaging in blowing up shipping, a lot of it American flagged, British flagged, European flagged shipping in the Red Sea, right? We all know this, right? We all read the newspapers, right? So it's very important to understand the context of these things in order to get to where we are. The origin of Yontat was in mostly conflict averse Netanyahu's desire to keep the Israelis out of the cauldron of a Syrian civil war. Keeping advancing Iranian forces and their proxies that are removed from Israel's northern border was a core part of the deal with Russia. That deal stipulated that the Iranians would be kept from operating along the Golani Heights, and the Russians acted as de facto arbiters of who controlled which part of whatever territory adjacent to Israel. Right? The Russian armed forces were basically a buffer zone between the Iranians and the Israelis. Right? They would not allow the Iranian troops to operate on the Israeli border, thus keeping potentially World War III from starting, right? or certainly a regional war from starting. Crucially, Moscow would allow the Israeli Air Force to carry out strikes against Iranian proxies that were operating in Syria. The IDF would routinely request that the Russian missiles and air defense systems, which protected Syria, be temporarily powered down. And the IDF would fly in and blow something up and fly back out, right? This is very important to understand. The Russians had a very particular, very circumscribed deal in a particular theater of war, right? This did not apply to other theaters where their Iranian allies were operating. That didn't mean that the Israelis could hit Iranian forces somewhere else. It didn't mean that the Russian regime, the Kremlin, had changed their mind on the two-state solution, or having delegations of Hezbollah and Hamas guys come to Moscow. This was a very narrow deal, and people who don't understand how narrow that deal was and how transactional that deal was often make misjudgments about the political relations between the Kremlin and Jerusalem. Arrangement allowed Israel to stay out of a war, which saw Tehran's proxies rampage across Arab lands, thus augmenting the power of a ring of enemies that surrounded Israel. So, part of the inadvertent outcome of some would say inadvertent, but let's say inadvertent outcome of the Obama administration's deal with Iran was that they moved closer to Lebanon and Syria, and they surrounded Jordan, right? And also the Iranians are now in power partly in certain parts of Iraq, right? We all know this. The Bush administration destabilized the Middle East. We all remember this.
Mm-hmm.
This was followed up by the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, which further destabilized the Middle East. Then the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal, continued to destabilize the Middle East, and now we are here where we are, right? We've had 20 years of very curious, using other adjectives, policy and foreign policy from now 4 American presidential administrations in a row. And so the outcome of it is that the Levant is much less stable than it was for a long time before that. And the Iranians were on the march for a very long time. For about eight years, Iranian Revolutionary Guards forces and their proxies were running havoc across the Middle East. They were, part of the deal was that their money would be released, and now flush with cash, they could wreak war in places like Syria, in places like Lebanon, where they had proxies. They have a relationship, obviously, with Hamas, although the reporting has not yet shown direct connections or not yet proven directly that Iran was behind the October 7th attacks, not directly. But certainly they training Hamas soldiers and forces for a very long time, and you have kind of a direct Shiite crescent leading from Gaza into Lebanon, through Syria, and directly into Iran, right? You all watch the news. It's not that complicated, right? You all know this, right? I imagine those sage people are nodding. Okay. The arrangement allowed Netanyahu to portray himself as a masterful geopolitical elder statesman within the Israeli field of electoral battle, right? He had a relationship with President Putin of Russia, and Israel has continued to balance Moscow's commitments and alliances within the Arab world with its other Muslim allies against a different commitment to a two-state solution within Israel. Russia has notably never wanted or requested any kind of diplomatic role in the Middle East. They've not really been outwardly involved in negotiations, whether the quartet, whether in the Chinese are like this also. They don't really get involved in Middle Eastern stuff. They don't really, even though the Russians are now a major power player in the Middle East, as the Americans have drawn down their position, the Russians have come in to fill the gap. They now have bases in Syria. They now can fly still with impunity around the Levant. And yet they don't really like to get involved in Middle East negotiation stuff. They stay out of it to the extent that they can. The Russian position is a direct return to the Soviet experience. Professor Shrayer is nodding, of third worldism, right? This is a direct return to the Soviet doctrine of supporting third world movements. Although I'm not sure you could use the word third world anymore, but Tier-Mondism is still a thing. Putin generally respects and somewhat fears Israel and has continued to balance Moscow's commitments. His own complex and fascinating thinking about Jews and Israel aside, and I write about this in my book, Jewish-Ukrainian Relations. He has a very, very interesting relationship to Jews and Judaism, Jewish culture. He's both a kind of a philo-Semite and anti-Semite at once. Although the war, just to go on a little tangent, the war with Ukraine has seen him take on very kitchen anti-Semitic, what Russians and Ukrainians refer to as kitchen anti-Semitism positions, which he had hitherto kept to himself. War does bring out people, what someone is like based on what they do in war. Putin has also shown himself not to be as nice on Jews and Judaism as he had portrayed himself to be for 20 years in power. His own complex and fascinating thinking about Jews and Israel aside, Russian foreign policy has had to balance relations with Israel against friendly, cordial, and transactional relationships with Jerusalem's numerous adversities. So, Iran. Iran is also at war with Ukraine. I don't know if you know this. The polling, you're Ukrainian American, you stop talking. The polling shows that only 25% of Americans understand this, that Iran is at war with both American allies in the Middle East, Sunni allies, our Arab Sunni allies, with Israel through proxy forces, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syrian PMCs, Sunni Arab dominated militias in Syria, and now also with Ukraine. Iran is a belligerent power in Ukraine. Iran is one of three countries who are belligerent powers fighting against the Russians, the other being the Ukrainians, the other ones being the Belarus, who are basically a colony now of Russia, and North Korea providing the shells, but they're not themselves a belligerent power. The Iranians are fighting against Ukraine on Ukrainian territory. There are Iranian troops, Persian troops, operating on Russian forward bases, especially in Crimea, teaching Russians how to use their Shahed 126 drones. These are kind of mid-tier, mid-price drones that the Russians have become very good at using to screen for Ukrainian anti-missile systems. So Iran is fighting actively against the Ukrainian army, and Iranian troops and Iranian special advisors, engineers are based in bases on occupied Ukrainian territory, Crimea. So Iran is not just a participant in the war, there are Iranian troops being stationed on Ukrainian territory. Russian bases in occupied Crimea, right? Did anyone know this? You probably knew this. Did you know this? You knew this. Okay, you're a Ukrainian American. The Iranian Shaheds are providing a kind of gap. They're filling a gap in Russian capacities, and they are used as part of salvos of payload packages, which also usually include intermediate and long-range ballistic missiles. So they'll be used to cover for the actual ballistic missiles. They'll send in typically like 50 Iranian-made drones, 10 rockets, and 12 ballistic missiles in order to penetrate the screen of Ukrainian air missile defense. Right. This is something that the Houthis are also learning from the experience in Ukraine now. Right. The Iranians are watching, and they're testing how to use these drones combined with missiles and rockets, smart missiles, dumb rockets, combinations of the two or of the three, in the Red Sea against Western shipping, against American shipping. And they've done a lot of the experimentation with how to deliver those pay packages and what combination of missiles and drones and rockets is the best for getting the least of them, the most number through air defenses in Ukraine. And they've applied those lessons to fighting against Western and American shipping in the Red Sea, right? So in many ways, this is one war, the war of Ukraine against Russia and Iran, and the conflict of America and Iranian-backed Houthis, Iranian-backed proxies around Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, and Israel's war with Hamas. It's all the same conflict. A lot of people don't understand that. It's very sad for me that as a Eastern European hand, that people don't understand that. I think it'd be better for everybody if more people understood that. So, Tehran continues clamoring for Russian technical assistance with its nuclear program. It was promised a certain amount of Russian diplomatic support to go with the increased cooperation in the production of sophisticated drones. Moscow is reported to have allowed Iran to build a massive drone factory in Russia. This is in October. We now know it's in Tatarstan. The Russians have paid Iran $4.5 billion for Shaheds. They've built and purchased a massive amount of them because they're just not producing enough, and they're throwing vast amounts of money and material at the war. Right? The Russian government now has 40% of its spending going to the military, and they have, I think, between 8 and 11%, depending on how you count, of the GDP going to military spending. Russia's now a war machine in every sense, right? A lot of that money goes towards buying stuff from North Korea, from Iran. Obviously, the Chinese have not sold, have been supportive, but they have not sold ammunition or missiles to the Russians. So a great deal of discrete cooperation takes place on the level of bypassing Western sanctions. The Iranians have become very good over the last 25 years, well, actually the last 35 years, in bypassing Western sanctions. Russians have looked at those examples in order to bypass the sanctions that we've put into place after the war began. I remember when I was a very young man in Tehran in 2010. Before anyone knew who I was, I could operate in Tehran. I can't now. And I had to change dollars for local currency, and it had to be done in all sorts of weird ways. I had to first trade them for rubles or Serbian money. I couldn't take money out of an ATM, so I had to call my bank in America and have Iranians in America put money into their bank accounts, and then I was given money at the same exact time from another bank account in Iran. Circumnavigating sanctions is actually very difficult, and so the Russians are learning from the Iranian example. They have a lot of experience with this. They are engaged in mutually transactional friendship. The Russians promised to sell, I believe it's Su-35s to the Iranians to give them a proper first-generation air force. They never delivered those planes. Why they didn't is an interesting question. But they would have, that would have put the Iranian Air Force at parity with any Arab Air Force or American proxy Air Force in the region. It would have restarted an Air Force arms race in the region. That didn't happen, but the Russians have been threatening and promising to do so, and the Iranians have been clamoring for it. Moscow has skillfully managed to find a common language between antagonistic Arabs, Iranians, and Jews, dealing with each discreetly on their own terms. Still, Putin has always been seen to view Israeli security concerns with appropriate and revered consideration. So, 3 days after the assault, Putin proffered his first comments of the war between Israel and Gaza amidst a conversation with the Prime Minister of Iraq. He stated that it was a clear example of a failure of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and that the Americans had not taken clear core interests of the Palestinian people into account. Typical Putin trolling, that's what he does. He did not call Netanyahu until 10 or 11 days after October 7th. He manifestly downgraded the Israeli relationship and upgraded the relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah. And again, this is a reversion to the Soviet mean. This is back to 1972, 1963, right? Certainly 1967. This is nothing new. Now, the Ukrainians have been clamoring for Israeli support. They've been asking for it for a long time. They've been wanting Israeli technology, especially in air missile defense, which the Israelis are very good at. Not everything that the Israelis have would be useful in Kyiv. Some of what they have is very particular to knocking down very primitive missiles that Hamas makes in their backyard, right? Not the kinds of things that the Russian army produces in factories. And yet, some of the anti-missile systems and PVO systems that the Israelis manufacture would have been very, very, very useful indeed. The Israelis have refused to sell them to Ukraine. They don't do that because of the relationship with Putin, because they're afraid for the lives of and property and health of Russian Jews within Russia proper. And they don't also do that because Russia, when you talk to Israeli elites and you talk to Israeli foreign policy people, and you talk to the people that they talk to in Washington, D.C., they'll say that Russia still has a very big regional footprint. We don't want to mess with them, right? They're, to a great extent, they're very, very afraid of what would happen if they destabilize the situation. So Ukraine, which has had military cooperation with Israel for a long time, has been trying very seriously to forge a relationship after October 7th. They're hoping that the Russian behavior since then would kind of pry the relationship with Moscow loose, and that they could make a better deal, that they could get Netanyahu to change his policy. Netanyahu has no interest in changing his policy. We'll see what happens. There are back-channel negotiations happening right now. The Ukrainians are very hopeful. They've not gotten what they wanted yet. There are ever more and more delegations of Israeli military men coming to Kyiv, and they've taken to giving interviews on Russian language television programs, both in Germany, in America, in Israel. So, someone told them you can talk about these things openly. It seems like we're inching towards a deal, but we never quite get there. We haven't had anything in the news about the announcement of a big deal. Those negotiations are taking place, but obviously they're not taking place quickly enough for the Ukrainians' happiness. So there's also the question of, obviously, military political support from the US Congress. Israel and Ukraine now are competing directly for resources, and in some cases shells. We can talk about that in more depth. Actually, let's start the conversation instead of a more organized thing. So this is a very, very brief sketch of the Moscow-Kiev-Jerusalem relationship. It's actually incredibly complex and there are a lot of moving parts to it. So maybe if you just ask me questions like it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so this is actually something I've discussed with our mutual friend, Claire Belinsky. But is he...
Claire Berlinski, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Claire Berlinski is a wonderful, wonderful journalist and friend of mine in Paris, and I often go on her podcast. She has a lovely Substack called The Globalist Cosmopolitan.
Cosmopolitan
The Globalist, yes. The Cosmopolitan Globalist. You should all go on your phone and subscribe to the Cosmopolitan Globalist. Is an absolutely wonderful daily Substack newsletter, and I often go on her podcast. Please, what did she say?
Well, this is what the discussion I've been asking her opinion on. She really hasn't come up with one. I'm curious what yours is. My curiosity is, as you have been seeing discussions in the past month, you know, in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Poland, that, you know, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is not sacrosanct. I think Vladislav Davidzon made statements along those lines. It would seem
Explain to the people here who are kids.
Yeah, he's the foreign minister of Poland, and someone I think known to be a pretty close friend of Israel in Polish politics as
Correct.
well.
Yes, that's right.
He's been making statements that, you know, if that basically Poland is not going back to being conquered and occupied by Russia, and if it takes Poland getting nuclear weapons to stop that, that's the way it's going to be. Now, my view would seem to be, if I was in Israel, if I've been saying my number one security concern for really decades has been stopping proliferation in the Middle East, I would be, even if Poland's in Europe and it's a different part of the world, I would be kind of very nervous that you're now seeing Poland and possibly Ukraine itself and other Eastern European countries talking about, well, we need nuclear weapons. My instinct would be, if I was Israel, I would want to be doing whatever I could to help Poland, to help Ukraine, to tamp down that type of talk and kind of keep the existing nuclear proliferation order, you know, as it is. And I don't seem to be seeing that from Jerusalem.
Cost benefit a lot. Basic cost benefit analysis. Your costs and your benefits. You have 8 or 9 different things that are in contradiction of each other. What do? You have nuclear non-proliferation. You have multiple wars on your border. You have a war now, a shooting war now with Hamas. You have 700 or so 1,000 Russian Jews that you need to keep from being repressed by a dictator who you need to be friends with, who's also operating on your border. These are a lot of contradictory goals and problems which you have to juggle at the same time. I would think, if I was them, that I would also help Poland, but again, I do talk to Israeli officials, and since the war started, they've become very insular. Israeli officials have kind of, this is always something that was very Israeli, that they didn't really care about what outsiders think in some way, and they're very self-involved in the sense that they're self-grounded. Since the war has begun, all sorts of American elites who thought that they had, and Polish elites and European elites who thought that they had excellent relationships with Israelis, have not been able to get through to anybody. As in, literally, people are not picking up their calls. And by people, I mean people at the highest levels of Israeli security and politics.
I just want to point out too, just to explain Polish politics, I mean, Vladislav Davidzon and Donald Tusk, who's the prime minister, they just became the government in the past few months.
Right.
I wouldn't say the previous, the PIS party in Poland, I would not necessarily say they were an anti-Israel party with a capital A. They definitely, this new government in Poland definitely has more, I think, probably better relations historically with Israel and with the Jewish community.
I'm so sorry, would you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, Timothy Smith, or Tim Smith.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thanks to, it's a friend of my friend, Claire. Netanyahu, now we're bringing Poland into it. Poland is a very important piece of a puzzle in Eastern Europe and in the Russia-Ukraine triumvirate, obviously, for all sorts of historical reasons and modern reasons, and because the Poles do not want the Russians on their border, and the Poles have been very good on Ukraine at the war. They're the leaders, along with the British and the Lithuanians and the Estonians, of the opposition to Moscow within the European Union. And Poland just had an election. Netanyahu had personal relationships with the previous government because of they were very conservative nationalists.
Yes.
This government is center-right, liberal by European standards. Like the nice liberal establishment came back to power in Poland, and they are rearming, and they're in the middle of an arms race. They're rearming, and they have good relations with Israel now also.
I'll point out too, for people who maybe don't know who Vladislav is, his wife is Anna.
Who actually spoke here a few years ago in her lecture. She spoke on the famine in Ukraine and Holodomor.
Right.
And I was very pleased to introduce her. Let
Very
me
late.
come out and maybe help moderate, because I think it'd be nice if we had some student questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're not a student.
I'm listening.
So, yes.
Yes, sir.
It's kind of implied that Israel has nukes.
Sure.
How does that fit into this?
I mean, well, like Israel doesn't deny it, but everyone knows that Israel has 80 nuclear weapons. This is not a secret, and this is deterrence. The nuclear deterrence is not. The Israelis aren't going to be using nukes against anybody like Russia. And this is not a big part of the story that I'm trying to tell of the relationship between Kyiv and Moscow and Jerusalem. They do have nuclear weapons, and it does deter large-scale states' attacks on them, right? Which is why the Iranians have never started a big war. Only proxies like Hamas or Hezbollah. You can't really nuke something right on your doorstep. You can't. The wind brings that right back to your population. You can't really use nuclear weapons that close to your country, right? Actually, one of the little tangent, but the Russians have gamed out actually using a tactical nuclear missile in parts of the front, and there were always two problems with it. The military guys would come back to Putin and say, well, first of all, we've already next Zaporizhzhia, why would we nuke something we already supposedly next anyway? And two, after the wind shifts, all the nuclear material will be poisoning Russian populations, which won't be very popular amongst Russian voters. So, actually using nukes is actually very difficult if you're using them on your next door neighbors, right? One of the reasons that during the Cold War, nuclear war was plausible is because Russia and America, the Soviet Union and America, are very far from each other. You can't really nuke something that tomorrow the wind changes and it's going to be in your backyard, right?
Yeah. And this, by the way, is a very valid point, because of course the memory of Chernobyl is very strong.
Sure.
In Europe. I can tell you, as someone who slept on soil covered by radioactive rain in late May, early June of 1986, I can attest to that. And so, of course, the idea of nuking Ukraine for the rain to return to Russia is not, fantasy.
It's not a popular thing with the Russian voters, I imagine. One of the reasons that they're not likely to do it.
Yeah, Jordan.
I was interested about when you were speaking about North Korea
Sure.
selling weapons to Russia.
Shells, yeah.
That's interesting. Like, I didn't know North Korea had weapons. I would think it would be the Russians that were selling to the North Koreans. But I saw that North Korea, I don't know if this has anything to do with this, but North Korea opened up for tourism, and the only tourists that are allowed in now are Russians.
Yeah.
So they're strengthening their Soviet era ties again.
Yes, they are. Great question. So, first of all, there's just a lot of leftover American shells all over both Koreas, left over from Vietnam. There's just a lot of. Every week, some crazy person calls me and says, "I know there's a warehouse in South Korea or Cambodia. Can you call Israeli intelligence and call them to get it, pick up?" And Everyone thinks they know where there's a secret cache of 155 millimeter shells, right? There's just a lot of it. Both South Korea and North Korea produce a lot of shells because they are continuously stockpiling shells in case they ever go to war, right? The South Korean army produces something like 90,000 shells a month. South Koreans are one of the biggest producers of shells. South Koreans do not sell directly to Ukraine for political reasons. They actually sell them to Poland. Poland just hands them right over to Ukraine. The North Koreans just give the shells that they have over to the Russians. And they have quite a lot of them. And the supply of shells that they got in one, I think it was like 800,000 or 1 million shells, was shipped over to Russia. It really changed the dynamic on sectors of the field. So it's actually really important. This is a war of massive attrition, an industrial scale war between Russia and Ukraine. And both of them were sitting on generations of Soviet-made shells that are now running out. The Ukrainians themselves need like 250,000 or 200,000 at the least shells a month. These are huge, huge amounts. I believe the UK makes like 30,000 a month or something like this. So they've gone all around the world looking for old shells, stockpiles of shells. They were competing for shells in Africa and Southeast Asia, wherever they could get weapons. There were agents flying around from both the Russian and the Ukrainian side buying up all the shells that they could get. And so the Western alliance is providing shells to the Ukrainians, and the revisionist, like let's call it axis of evil, whatever you want to call it, the revisionist powers of North Korea, Belarus, and Iran are providing shells and missiles to the Russians, right? Because neither Russia nor Ukraine makes enough in order to give them a competitive edge in the war. These are just huge, huge amounts of munitions that are being used up every single month.
You're just talking about shells. I was wondering if you talk about manpower and like how is going on, and like I know there's issues in Ukraine with additional mobilization. So could you talk about that and like how you see that playing out?
Let young lady gets to talk next. Yeah. So look, both Russia and Ukraine have manpower issues. Russia's fewer manpower issues because Russia has 3.5 times the population, and they have tons of money. And it turns out that you can literally make men walk barefooted to hell for enough money. It's actually not crazy amounts of money. I personally would not join the Russian army for $2,500 a month to fight in the Battle of Avdiivka. Maybe some of you would. It's not a lot of money to fight on the Eastern Front. The Ukrainians are running out of men. It's just a smaller population by a factor of 3.5, right? And Russia has, both sides have mandatory conscription. Russia has more people that they're willing to throw away, and they've opened up their prisons, and they've been able to get a lot of traction just by throwing men into meat grinder assaults, so-called Zerg assaults against Ukrainian entrenched positions. The Ukrainians simply don't have enough men. There is a continuous argument and debate on whether they should conscript more men. They simply don't have enough to hold the line as it is. And a lot of people have been fighting for 2 years. A lot of those guys have not been rotated out. They're exhausted. There are a lot of people who fought for a long time, and they just need a couple of months away from the front to refit, to get their head in order. And of the 7 guys I was drinking with in Kyiv 3 nights before the war began, I think 2 of them are alive. Just of those 7 officers I was with. A lot of the young guys that I met on the front line in March and May and April and June of 22, I think the losses amongst those guys I was with are very high. The professional army on both sides has been attrited, so that both sides are just throwing in less educated, more portly, older guys. The Ukrainians don't because they don't want to throw away the next generation. They don't conscript anyone younger than 27. I think the age has been lowered to 26 or 25 now, but they don't conscript young guys. everyone knows war is a very young man's game. 23-year-olds, 22-year-olds make the best soldiers. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now 43. It's a middle-aged army, right? The Russian army is slightly younger, but also it does not look like a great army. It is no longer a professional army in vast swaths of the field. There are a lot of guys who've been called up and conscripted who do not look at their fighting best. They're not 22-year-olds who've gone through military training for 3 years. So, yeah, it's a problem for both sides. It's a political problem for Putin because he does not want to mobilize again, and in a liberal democracy, you know, what people think is important, right? So it's a bigger problem for Ukrainians. I think the young lady had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you think the future of U.S. involvement in Israel and Ukraine looks like, and is there a particular situation or event that would either like dramatically decrease or increase U.S. involvement?
That's a great question. Currently, the bill in Congress, as you all know, probably is stalled. The Taiwanese, the Taiwan support is like the tail on the two-headed dog on the bill. It's a smaller proportion of the spending. Ukraine and Israel are part of the same bill, which is stalled for additional support. If this White House could not give money to Israel, they would not do that. They are very pissed off, and they've been signaling that, and it's entirely possible that the politics will change very quickly, even within the next days or weeks, on Israel. On Ukraine, there is still a bipartisan consensus, right? I've been watching the fighting over it in Washington, D.C. over the last month. It's all very depressing, but the votes are there for the bill, right? Most members of Congress are still in favor of giving money to Ukraine. It's 10 to 12 people in like the Trump NatCon, whatever you want to call it, the National Conservative or Trumpian wing, 10 to 12 congressmen and women who are really against giving aid to Ukraine. And there are 30 to 40 others who are concerned with getting primaried, right? So even if you look at the number of United States senators, and senators don't get reelected every 2 years. They don't have to get primary next year. They can wait another 4 years until their next election. Only like 18 Republican senators voted for the bill. Now it passed, but the Ukrainians I was talking to who were whipping the votes are like, they're telling me they're going to get 26, 27 Republican senators voting in favor of the bill. They got 18 at the end of it. It's not great, you know? At this point, I think it's, well, no one really knows. I do watch the politics in DC, and the proposition of what the chances of getting the bill passed goes up and down every week. At this point, I'd imagine it's 60-40 that the Ukrainians will get the military support at this point. But next week it could be 50-50 or 30-70, right? Depends. So I for all the things that I know and have done, I've seen, I really try not to be in the future prediction business. It's a lousy business to be in.
There's a.
Okay, so by military support, do you mean the Senate bill or some of the other stuff that they're trying to whip up right now in the Congress?
I mean, look, we're gonna go off into wonkery. Obviously, there is a bill. There are alternative bills. There have been new ideas in the last week about making it loans as opposed to security guarantees. Without going into wonkery of exactly how we're going to structure the bill, of what it is or what the appropriations looks like, it just doesn't matter. Like the bill either goes through or it doesn't. No need to talk about the Senate reconciliation process. It's a bit too insider baseball for what we're doing here today. Yes, sir.
You said earlier that you view, or it's possible to view, these independent wars as one larger conflict.
Absolutely.
And when you look at all the actors, I mean, they span 3 continents: the U.S., UK, Israel, Yemen, Poland, Russia, Ukraine. North Korea list goes on. And it seems like a very global or worldly war.
Sure.
Why is it being discussed as such?
That's such a great question. This is absolutely wonderful. I would give you A, one of my students, and you could be when I come back to teach in the spring of, when I come back here to teach in the spring of 2025, you should be one of my students. Many people, especially in the gatekeeping journalist professions, don't understand that this is the same conflict. I think there are people who do understand that this is a kind of a singular conflict over liberal democracy and the future of the American, European-led world order, the World War II post-war consensus, whatever you want to call it, the post-Cold War consensus, the post-war consensus, neoliberalism, the American hegemony, Pax Americana, whatever you want to call it. Lots of people have different names for it. This is a direct challenge to the way that we have governed the world and to the peace that we've had after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? And so you have this alliance of states that would love to see that world order crumble. NATO, the supremacy of the Americans, the supremacy of a certain kind of arrangement of peaceful institutions the world over, right? So the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans are all prodding and testing, right? They're all trying to destroy this order, especially the security guarantees that underpin it. NATO especially, right? You don't actually have to destroy NATO, you just have to prove that it doesn't exist, right? So, why is it that people don't get this? I don't know, maybe I should write better op-eds? I don't know.
May I jump in for one
Yes,
second?
sir.
Yes, so I apologize, but sometimes professors get the upper hand. I just want to circle back. This is in no way a challenge, but
Please challenge me.
No. I'm in no position to challenge you because I'm an armchair scholar and you report from the trenches. That's very important. But you made a seminal point that I think we should dwell on for a minute, which is that Putin is reclaiming the old Soviet sphere of influence.
Absolutely.
We talk a lot about this when we study the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union has spheres of influence. And large parts of the Near East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and South and Central America were in the Soviet sphere of influence. And for years, the Soviet Union did very well there. And it's also very important to remember that the Soviet Union created the PLO, trained it, and this was part of how it did business in its sphere of influence.
I should have sketched that out more. I just
No. This is the point you made is very important because what you're suggesting is that what is happening now is this Putin not obviously only reclaiming Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union, which he always said he would,
right,
but also reclaiming his sphere of influence in the Near East. Now, look, we all like to think that Israel has the best analysts, but it seems that not only is the love affair with the Kremlin ending, but also, how is it possible that this basic point was not being made loud and clear even 3 years ago? And I know that basically what is happening in the Near East is that Putin is very deliberately claiming inch by inch the old Soviet sphere of influence, which also means, of course, that it's eventually going to back up wars against Israel.
Yeah, I mean, they are afraid of this. This is, once you have bases in the Middle East around Israel, you have Israel surrounded with a circle of bases. I mean, it's only a matter of time before you make a decision whether you want to do that or not. This is scary to the Israeli security officials. They've priced it in. They know very well that this is a problem. But also, they just thought the relations with Russia were really good until recently, and they didn't know that this could escalate that quickly. But actually, change in human affairs and IR and political relations and international relations happens very quickly. People aren't accustomed to how quickly things will change and how brutally. And so Netanyahu really thought that his personal relationship with Putin, which was very, very strong and very firm, would protect Israel from whatever else was happening and would ensure a security blanket. that was not the case. Now that Russia needs Iran a lot more than it needs Israel, they've pivoted towards the Iranians. They're not declaring war against Israel, certainly not yet. But they need Israel a lot less than Israel thought that they needed them, and that security alliance turned out to be not as strong as we thought. Yes, Vlad.
I would like to suggest something what I thought. Why? Try to answer the question you just asked.
Sure.
My name is Vladislav. I know this guy for a while here, and not in terms of education, but anyway,
Sure.
from Kyiv. So here's the situation what I think happening. For many, many years, we have rationale as the rule of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, if I make money, you make money, both of us together can make more money. Why we can't be friends?
Free trade.
Yeah, you know what I mean? That was the idea. In parallel with that, politically, everybody was saying, starting from 60s, right, all of those, peace movement, all of this Imagine songs and other things. We're saying more about it today's like legalizing marijuana. I'm not it's okay. So, but my point is, people used to, and you are a younger generation, I think you're living in a cusp of very big change. Because people lived for a while, this idea, and all of those politicians, journalists, everybody else, based this idea that peace is normal and great. And the only thing we need to do is pay off. Do you remember what happened in North Korea in the last 20 years? Every time they ran out of rice, they immediately, start scaring the world that we're gonna nuke someone, or like show it someone, and the world gave them rice. No, seriously, take a look at the, Tokyo. So for a while, the world was sure that you can buy off peace. And this is a good population. Well, you and me, we both read a long time ago, and you probably too, Leon Furtwängler. Remember Furtwängler? The world called the City Ottoman, right? The family of Ottoman. About Jews in Germany.
Sure.
It's a real, it's based probably on the real stories, but basic story made, by the way, it's interesting reading for anybody who's reading about Israel, Jews and Holocaust. Basically, German Jews, when Hitler came to power, were absolutely sure. They asked them a question, why just sell everything, run? And the answer was, we can do business with Nazis, why not? We just pay them more money. And that was in that book.
Oh, sorry, I think we should not make those blanket statements.
No, but in
I think
book.
you're discussing a work of fiction about one Jewish
Right, I know.
family out of
No, but my
all
question-
the other Jewish families.
my
I'm
question
sorry,
is-
I apologize. I just have to say, for the sake of
No,
correcting the
it's
record.
in the book. But my point is,
He's making
that
it's a metaphor.
idea of ability to do business and money and logic is the only important thing. I think is right now not going out of the window, but like kind of have a question. And maybe that is the reason why people don't see.
Thank you for your...
There's a lot there. Let's unpack it. I would just say that there were, the post-Cold War consensus in the 90s. We thought that we could get the Chinese or other people to become more democratic if only we built an economic system for them. That free trade would make them liberalize. That turned out to be a false set of assumptions. You can help your authoritarian neighbors get rich, and they will still not become liberal or democratic. And in fact, more often than not, they will corrupt you, which is what happened with Europe, swaths of Europe, and certainly the UK and the Russians. The Russians and the Chinese both embraced hyper-capitalism, let alone capitalism, without democracy or freedom or human rights. And they were able to figure out that we wanted their money more than we wanted them to be liberal or to respect human rights norms. And they're very cynical, and they thought that they could bribe us. And to a point, they were correct. And a lot of where we are now in all of this is the outcome of 4 or 5 different American presidential administrations not pushing back hard enough against the Russians. One of the reasons Putin was so surprised that we sanctioned the hell out of Russia in 2022, although we could have done more, and the sanctions the sanctions regime has kind of mostly failed. It's really hard to sanction a country the size of Russia whose oil and gas everybody wants, not Cuba. One of the reasons he was so surprised that we put in a real serious sanctions regime and took them off SWIFT and banned imports and exports and everything, banned selling microchips and planes and the rest of it, was that every time the Russians did something, we did nothing. We didn't push back. We started in the 90s with the invasion of Moldova, Transnistria, nothing happened. Then they invaded Georgia, took a chunk of Georgia, nothing happened. Took over Abkhazia, Georgian enclave of Russia, nothing happened. Invaded Ukraine in 2014. Obama administration gave a slap on the wrist. I've had Ukrainian generals complain to me of the Obama State Department, told them not to fight back, which is true. In 2015, the Russian Air Force intervened in Syria. They won that civil war on Assad's behalf. No one did anything. Then finally, they start going around Africa, acting as a kind of consulting service with guns for any dictator for hire, right? We all know this. The Russian Wagner group goes around Africa, exchanging military power for diamonds and gold.
Yeah, they have a new name now, though.
They've renamed them, yeah, I know. Although I think the Wagner group in Africa is still Wagner, but I don't remember if they are. But yes, they've renamed the organization inside Russia and they've pulled them into other structures. The point is, the West did nothing. Did nothing after Georgia, nothing after Syria, we did nothing after all these interventions against French interests in Africa. We did nothing when they invaded Ukraine once. And then finally, we kind of did something in 2022. Not enough, but we did something. So Putin was surprised, right? Finally, someone pushed back against him. He kept probing and probing and probing and using force. And finally, someone did something, and he was surprised. Any other students have any questions? Oh, lots of students.
Shifting topic a little bit.
Sure.
Israel relations.
Uh-huh.
So, would you say the Russian Jewish elite in Russia have any power and how do they feel about Russian assertions that they should go back to 67 borders and general support proxy wise for Hamas?
So I just think Russian elites within Russia don't care about that kind of thing at all, and I've met a lot of them. I mean, there are Russian billionaires like Friedman, who I've talked to, and he's business. Those kinds of guys are business first, foremost, right? They don't really care about whatever the Russian position on the West Bank or Gaza is. There are lots of Russians within politics, administrative structures, the Kremlin, who might care about it more or less. The main Russian propagandist, Solovyov, is a Jew, and he's complete catastrophe. I would excommunicate him tomorrow, but he has all sorts of opinions about Israel. You could Google them. Solovyov is very, very open about what he thinks about these things. Like a guy like Abramovich, who was a back channel negotiator between the Ukrainians, the Israelis, the Russians, and the Americans. What does he actually think of in his heart of hearts about Hamas guys coming in and sitting in the Kremlin and talking to Foreign Minister Lavrov? I don't know. I think Russian elites are Russians taking care of their own interests first and foremost. Whether they're Jewish or not, I think doesn't matter. If they cared that much about being Jewish, they would be living in London or New York or Israel, right? They care. They are Russian citizens who are first and foremost Russian citizens. So, it's a very complex thing. And one of the things that this war did was that it destroyed this multi-decade thing where all sorts of people who had free passports, I'm not going to name names, although I do know a lot of these people. Free passports. A Ukrainian-born Jew from Lviv who had a Russian passport, an Israeli passport, and a British passport, who was living between London and New York, had to choose sides, and he went back. His business partner was sanctioned, sold off what he could get rid of, and was left back to Russia. A lot of different people in London, in the Russian oligarchy, had to pick whether they were aligned with the West or they were Russians first and foremost. This is one of the refreshing, I mean, there are small silver linings to this war. One of the refreshing things is that everyone had to choose a side. We now know who everybody was. Because for many years, lots of people played a double game, pretending that they were Western when they were in London or New York City, and pretending that they were Russian when they were in Russia. And they were also very successful in corrupting British elites and corrupting European elites, right? And February 24th, 2022 put an end to that little game. There's a lot of people who showed their true colors, right?
You were kind of talking about how this kind of two sides of the war, and it was interesting to me because when you look at kind of what the public says, there was a lot of widespread support for Ukraine during that war. Now you see a lot of people fighting for Palestine, even though they're kind of
Where?
just if you look at the media, I guess.
But in which country?
Here, I guess.
Yeah, okay.
There's a lot of that, and since they're kind of on opposite sides of the war in a way, is there reasoning of why this is happening?
Okay, so Ukraine and Israel have kind of scrambled people's brains in a way. So some people don't know what to make of it. So I'll give you an example. I was at dinner. I just came from London yesterday. I flew in from Paris where I did some stuff, and I was giving a talk on Saturday at a Chabad in London. And Friday evening I went out with a dear friend of mine who is a Polish Jew with a British passport. And he is a radical leftist. He's a Polish Marxist, and he's a radical leftist. And he was wearing a keffiyeh at dinner. And he's a good friend of mine. It's fine. He's my friend. He's a Polish count and a Jew and a Marxist. And he was wearing a keffiyeh. We're having a nice dinner. We're having a story with other friends. And I was wearing a Ukrainian-American flag lapel and a NATO pin. And half the restaurant kept staring at us because they couldn't understand how a guy in a three-piece suit with a NATO lapel and a Ukraine-American friendship pin in his lapel was having a nice dinner with his friend with a keffiyeh. Half the restaurant was staring at us. They couldn't understand. How is it? And my friend is a Pole, so he hates Russians. He couldn't, and he's an expert on Russian socialist brutalist architecture, and he's a Polish Marxist, and he is a great supporter of Ukraine, and he was helping Ukrainian refugees. Dear friend of mine, we're sitting there, he's in a keffiyeh, I'm wearing a NATO pin, and half the restaurant is staring at us because they can't understand. And why is that interesting? It's because to a particular kind of leftist in America now, and in London now, as I saw on Friday at dinner, if you're wearing a keffiyeh, how could you possibly be on the side of American intervention and NATO support of Ukraine, right? So it was all very amusing. Just to say that, ideologically, some people don't understand how to be on side with both, a defense of Israel, while the same kinds of arguments can be made about Palestine, right? So some people's mind doesn't hold two ideas at the same time, including half the people at that restaurant in London on Friday.
But wait, so
Yeah.
you're saying that because basically, let's just sharpen this up. I think it's a great question. But
Yeah.
is your point though that people who truly care about Ukraine and Israel should not be wearing the keffiyeh? I hate to put it so
No,
simply.
I make no normative comments about my dear friend Michał Morawski, Count Morawski, who's a Jew, a Polish count, and a Marxist, and can certainly hold three ideas which are very different from each other at once in his head. I make no normative claims about that, but I'm making descriptive claims about the fact that it's difficult for some people to hold the idea of why are we helping quote unquote colonizers if they're Israeli when we're against colonizers who are Russians in Ukraine. Like to some people that is a very difficult thing to unpack. They don't understand, right? I make no such claims because I want my comments to be.
This is not your claim, but this is a justification of how great journalists function.
Sure.
Right? Okay.
By the way, a very good journalist, like a good politician, you really should know what I actually think about anything. Yes, sir.
What's it count is that it counts as nobility versus?
Yeah, he's a baron. My friend is a baron. My friend is half Polish aristocrat and half Jewish Marxist intellectual. He's wearing keffiyeh. He's wearing keffiyeh in London, and he's a great supporter of Ukraine. And we got refugees out, and he's my dear friend. And I was sitting with a NATO NATO pin in my lapel, and people were staring at us because it couldn't compute to them how the two of us could be friends. And obviously we are friends. We've been to Ukraine together, and it's just in those social circles, certainly in that restaurant, people who were wearing keffiyehs are certainly against Ukraine. They're for structural reasons, which is what the question was.
Yeah. Shall we take one more question? Because we want to leave some time for book signing.
Sure.
Please, Isaiah.
I was curious, speaking of NATO, coming November coming up, and Trump possibly taking the presidency.
Sure.
Coming out of NATO. And there was a bill passed in December that would prevent him from coming out of NATO except without congressional approval. But then I also heard that there are ways to get around that. The U.S. we could not leave NATO, but still not donate money and contribute troops to Europe. So how do you think Trump coming into power affects Ukraine, but also Israel? Because I know
This is the final question in every single talk. 6 times someone asked me this in 14 days. It's fine. First of all, those well-meaning attempts to constrain Trump don't mean jack. I mean, this is a very strong presidential system with a presidential with presidential decree executive order. You could do more or less anything. Obviously, he would have to do all sorts of things in order to actually get out of NATO. But the commander in chief can essentially scuttle the idea that Americans will fight for NATO, and that if any NATO country invokes Article 5, that American troops would come in. If Donald Trump comes to power and he truly wants to destroy NATO and NATO as an institution of deterrence against Russia and China and Iran, he can do that easily, right? No amount of passing those kinds of preventive laws in order to to augur more power onto Congress on preventing him from doing something to NATO is going to actually constrain him. I don't believe it. If he wants to destroy NATO, he will be able to do so in 50 different ways before breakfast without even thinking much about it, right? He's the commander-in-chief. That's not going to save NATO, right? Well-intentioned as those kinds of initiatives are, much as I support them, my NATO pin, that's not going to save Ukraine or anybody else. Donald Trump obviously does not like Ukraine. Donald Trump does not like Ukrainians. Ukraine was part of the impeachment process. Certain Ukrainians behaved in silly ways during the 2016 elections. Certain Ukrainians, faced with a very radical candidate, including the Ukrainian ambassador in Washington, D.C. at the time, Mr. Chali, did certain things which, in retrospect, were not the best way to play it, including writing an op-ed in The Hill saying candidate Trump is wrong about Crimea. Those are things that he should have not done. Mistakes were made. Donald Trump has a long memory. He has traits, whatever those good or bad traits are. Certainly not being vindictive is not one of those traits. Not to make normative comments. There's a debate amongst my friends and colleagues who are trying to figure out what to do in the situation on whether he can be swayed. I don't think he can be swayed, and with every day it turns out more and more that he makes pro isolationist comments. I do believe that there is some chance that he could try to triple down on American support in order to, let loose a deal with Putin. But ultimately, he doesn't care about Ukraine, doesn't like Ukraine, and he's deeply transactional. And if he even does continue giving the support, it will be deeply transactional, and the Ukrainians will have to pay for the support. Obviously, it's not as bad as some people think, but yeah, obviously the Biden administration is less of a gamble in terms of what their policy would be. Much as they've slow-rolled the defense, right? The Biden administration says one thing and does something else. They don't actually want the Ukrainians to win. They don't want the Russians to lose also, right? We know this, right? Vlad is, my namesake Vlad is nodding sagely, right? So in between an administration where they're slow-rolling support and don't want you to lose, and kind of a Joker situation out of Batman where you don't know what he's going to do, except you kind of know he doesn't like you. You know, if your one issue in American policy is Russia-Ukraine war, as it is mine, you probably should vote Biden, right? What to do about Trump is a question that keeps up people in the Ukrainian presidential administration late at night, and there's no good answer to that. So.
Yes, we unfortunately are out of time.
Did you want something else?
Because I asked part of my question on the Israel side, so just curious.
The Israel side.
Okay, let's just do that.
Yeah, the Israel side. What do you mean? Trump on Israel?
What will Trump presidency mean for the Israeli war?
Great question. I mean, it depends where the conflict is in 8 months from now. Will Hezbollah come into the war? Will there actually be shooting war with Iran? And, obviously, you're going back and forth between, radically incommiserate positions in Washington on the Middle East, right? It used to be that America had a consensus on what its Middle Eastern policy would be. That was kind of shattered by the Bush administration. Then the Obama people did something else. Then Trump came in and he realigned the Saudis and the Israelis again. And then the Biden people came in. The Biden administration is full of Obama people who already made their bones on the JCPOA, and they realign again. So you do have this kind of back and forth on alliances that never existed during the Cold War because there's no actual consensus of what American foreign policy should be. No one really knows what it is or what it should be. There's no American elite bipartisan consensus like you had for 60 years during the Cold War, right? So these things are going to be more shaky, and our allies everywhere, from the Middle East to Africa to Southeast Asia, have already taken, they've taken sight of what's going on, and they're looking to themselves. The Europeans are looking to rearm and to help the Ukrainians themselves. The Israelis would also be intelligent to make secondary choices for themselves, just as other American allies are doing, right? So Trump is more likely to give Israel whatever it wants and to give Ukraine nothing of what it wants, whereas the Biden administration the other way around, kind of a splitting of foreign policy on a partisan consensus way, which is very bad actually. This was never the case in America for 60, 70 years, but there is no post-Cold War consensus again on what American policy should be. So I think
Thank you. I think this is a good time to thank. I don't know what I'm thanking him for, but to thank Vladislav Davidzon for his wisdom, for his experience, and also for his ability to see differences and similarities, but also similarities and differences. I hope you come again to talk.
I would like that. Thank you so much.
And folks, there are books to be signed, and take advantage of that, please. Thank you.